In a world defined by boundaries, some stories cannot be contained by borders. This is Of the World, Chronicles of Civilization. Today, we cross the English Channel into the teeth of the most heavily fortified coastline on Earth, into the thunder of naval bombardment, the roar of 10,000 aircraft, and the desperate courage of 156,000 men who stormed the beaches of Normandy to begin the liberation of a continent. June 6, 1944, the day the tide of the Second World War turned forever. This is D-Day, the longest day. By the spring of 1944, the Allied planning for the invasion of Nazi-occupied France was complete. Codenamed Overlord, its scale was without precedent. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower oversaw nearly 3 million men. The invasion fleet comprised over 6,900 vessels. Southern England had become a massive military staging ground, its harbors and fields choked with men and machines. The target was a 50-mile stretch of Normandy coastline, defended by Erwin Rommel's Atlantic Wall, a network of concrete bunkers, minefields, and beach obstacles designed to make any assault suicidal. Rommel had ordered millions of steel obstacles and mines planted below the tide line to rip open landing craft. 5 beaches, 5 assaults on which the fate of the free world would turn. The Americans would hit Utah and Omaha, the British Gold and Sword, the Canadians Juno. It was the most complex military operation ever conceived. If it failed, there was no second chance. But before any soldier set foot on Normandy's sand, the Allies had to convince Adolf Hitler that the invasion would come elsewhere. Operation Fortitude was the most elaborate military deception in history. A phantom army was conjured into existence in southeast England, directly across the channel from Pas de Calais, the shortest crossing point. Inflatable tanks were arranged in fields for German reconnaissance. Fake radio traffic simulated an army of 350,000 soldiers. Double agents fed false intelligence confirming Normandy was merely a feint. Commanding this phantom force was General George S. Patton, the commander the Germans feared most. The ruse worked. Even after Normandy was breached, Hitler held back his panzer reserves for 7 crucial weeks, convinced Calais was the real target. It was the lie that won the war. The invasion was scheduled for June 5, 1944. But a savage storm swept the channel, churning the sea. Launching the invasion into that tempest was impossible. In a cramped library, Eisenhower gathered his commanders. The mood was grim. The tides and moonlight required would not align again for 2 weeks, and delay risked exposing the secret. Then, Chief Meteorologist Group Captain James Stagg delivered a forecast. A narrow window of improved weather would open on June 6th. It was not ideal, but it might be enough. The room fell silent. The decision rested on one man. Eisenhower paced, staring at the rain-streaked windows. Then he spoke 5 words that changed history. "Okay, let's go." Hours before dawn on June 6th, the first wave came from the sky. Over 18,000 paratroopers from the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions and the British 6th Airborne Division hurled themselves into the night. They jumped from planes flying through intense anti-aircraft fire. Each man carried a small metal cricket to identify friends in the darkness. The drops were scattered. High winds and flak blew units miles off target. Some men landed in flooded fields and drowned under their heavy gear. In St. Mare-Église, Private John Steele's parachute snagged on the church steeple. He hung there for hours, playing dead, while a battle raged below. Yet from this chaos, the paratroopers adapted. Small bands of lost soldiers found each other by the click of their crickets. They formed ad hoc groups, seized critical bridges, and blocked German reinforcements. By dawn, thousands of men were scattered across Normandy, isolated and outgunned, but unbroken. At 6:30 in the morning, the landing craft hit the beaches. On Utah, strong currents pushed the Americans 2,000 yards south of their target, away from heavy defenses. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr. waded ashore and declared, "We'll start the war from right here." Utah fell with fewer than 200 casualties. On Gold, the British fought through bunkers and advanced inland. On Sword, British commandos landed to the sound of bagpipes, Piper Bill Millen playing as bullets churned the water. On Juno, the Canadians faced savage resistance. High seas delayed their landing craft, forcing them to hit the beach without preliminary bombardment. Entire companies were cut to pieces, but the Canadians fought with a fury that cleared fortified houses block by block, advancing farther inland than any other force that day. And then there was Omaha. This 4-mile crescent of sand was backed by 100-foot bluffs, studded with bunkers, and swept by machine gun fire. A veteran German division defended the sector. The Germans called this Fortress Europe, and at Omaha the name was earned. The preliminary bombardment largely missed, its bombs falling inland. 27 of 29 amphibious tanks sank in the rough seas. The infantry would have to take the beach alone. At 6:30, the first wave entered a slaughterhouse. Landing craft dropped ramps into chest-deep water. Soldiers carrying heavy gear sank. Those who surfaced faced 200 yards of open sand swept by crossfire. Men fell in windrows. Medics crawled through the tide, dragging the wounded. The water turned red. Entire companies were annihilated. Company A, composed of boys from the small town of Bedford, Virginia, lost 19 of its 35 men in the first minutes. Bedford would suffer the highest per capita losses in America. By mid-morning, the assault was on the verge of total failure. General Omar Bradley seriously considered evacuating the beach. The American foothold was measured in yards and paid for in blood. What saved Omaha was the individual acts of desperate men. Colonel George Taylor stood in the carnage and shouted, "Two kinds of people are staying on this beach, the dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." Small groups of soldiers stopped waiting for orders. They cut wire and crawled up the bluffs, silencing bunkers. Navy destroyers, risking running aground, closed to within 800 yards to fire point blank at the German positions. Inch by inch, the Americans clawed their way forward. By nightfall, they held a fragile strip of soil at a cost of 2,000 casualties. Omaha was not won. It was survived. On the German side, June 6th was a catastrophe of hesitation and delay. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was not in Normandy that morning. Believing the storm ruled out an attack, he was in Germany celebrating his wife's birthday. Initial reports were confused. Haunted by the ghost of Operation Fortitude, commanders disagreed on whether Normandy was the main assault or a diversion. Most critically, the Panzer reserves could not be released without Hitler's personal authorization, and Hitler was asleep. Terrified of waking him, his staff delayed the request. By the time he authorized their release in the afternoon, Allied planes controlled the skies, destroying the armor on the roads. The window to push the Allies back was closed forever. By midnight on June 6th, 156,000 Allied soldiers were ashore. 10,000 were casualties. The beachheads were not yet linked and the hold was precarious, but the Atlantic wall was breached. The fortress door was open. Within a week, over 300,000 troops and 50,000 vehicles crossed the channel, aided by artificial mulberry harbors. Over the next 11 months, Allied armies liberated Paris, survived the Battle of the Bulge, crossed the Rhine, and drove into Germany. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler died by suicide in his Berlin bunker. The road to victory began on those beaches, in the courage of ordinary men. The Normandy Landings remain the largest seaborne invasion in the history of warfare. No operation before or since has matched its scale, its complexity, or its audacity. D-Day was not merely a battle, it was the hinge upon which the entire 20th century turned. More than 4,000 Allied soldiers were killed on June 6th alone. Their average age was 22. They came from farms in Kansas and fishing villages in Nova Scotia, from coal towns in Wales and mill towns in Ontario, from the boulevards of Paris and the hill country of Free France. Most had never left their home countries before the war. Many never would again. Today, above the bluffs of Omaha Beach, 9,387 white marble crosses and stars of David stand in perfect rows at the American cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer. They face west, toward the home most of those buried beneath them never saw again. The grass between the headstones is kept immaculate, the silence broken only by wind and the distant murmur of the sea. Every year on the 6th of June, the people of Normandy lay flowers on those graves, not because they were asked to, because they remember. This has been Of the World, Chronicles of Civilization. The guns have fallen silent, but the stories never will.